Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're well. Very happy to be back. Very happy to welcome back, after a bit of an extended absence, SportsPro editorial director Michael Long. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Owen. How are you doing? How's everything been in my absence?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. You've been a good few weeks, couple of months. I understand you have a pretty good excuse for having missed the last few editions of the podcast.
I do. I have a son now, Owen. I have a new member of the family. So being very much kept on my toes and kept up at night. But other than that, it's good to be back. Returned last week, and I've been tuning into the Sports Pro podcast, manfully hosted by your good self. It's kept me going over the last 8 weeks or so.
Well, congratulations indeed to you, Mike. This is all staged, of course. I was aware of this news. Didn't just find that out, but yeah, for the benefit of our listeners to join us all in our good wishes. Sports Pro has a white paper out this week in partnership with Limelight Networks, making the personal possible, powering interactivity and new experiences in sports OTT. And we're joined by Charlie Kraus from Limelight Networks in the second part of the podcast. Before that, as incredible as it may seem, we are on the cusp of a sporting summer here in Europe. And even more incredibly, some lucky people are actually going to be able to go and watch it. It barely feels like we've been let out of the house to this point. I'm sure, Mike, you feel that a little bit more strongly than some of the rest of us, given the hours that you'll have been keeping. But, you know, the French Open is on this week at Roland Garros. We have Test cricket with fans back in England from this week as well. The derby at the weekend. And then the really big stuff, which is going to occupy a lot of our time on the podcast over the next couple of months. UEFA Euro 2020 finally arrives at the end of next week. 24 men's national football teams playing in 11 host cities in the biggest sporting event in, let's be scientific about this, quite a long time. And we're going to be following that tournament week to week here on the podcast, following up on some of the themes and the storylines that will be bound to get the industry talking over the next month or so. That coverage starts a week today as you're listening, if you are listening on the day of release, with a commercial preview here on the Thursday pod. And we will be returning to the tournament once a week until it all ends in my hometown, Wembley, towards the middle of July. And then we don't have all that long after that to gather ourselves again for the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. It's another pretty significant event, whatever form it ends up taking. And you can expect some expanded coverage of that as well, albeit from a little bit further away. So with all that to come, Mike, we're just going to take some time this week to check in on a couple of stories, maybe two or three from the past few days. We'll see how we get on. But they really knit together a few strands, not just from the early part of this year, but really the whole pandemic era, if we can call it that, and before that, and kind of into the future. I think some pretty big topics emerging. I mentioned the French Open, and we should caveat this by saying we are recording on a Tuesday afternoon, aware that people won't be getting this until Thursday, and this has been a pretty fast-moving story. But the first thing we are going to talk about is Naomi Osaka's withdrawal from the clay court major. She'd said that she did not feel she could do press, and that story has kind of snowballed, or the kind of conversation around that snowballed to the point where she has pulled out altogether. It's pretty remarkable that it's come to that, and I suppose that says a lot about some of the protocols, not just around tennis tournaments, but around the way that media is organized with partners and with press attending the event. I mean, there's a lot to dive into. What was your initial response? Let's take it back a few days to where she had said that she just wasn't keen to, she was happy to pay whatever fines it was going to take, but she didn't feel that she felt she wasn't in a place her mental health, where she wanted to kind of go straight off the court into a mandatory press conference. Let's try and disentangle that side of it from what she subsequently has felt, in her personal state of mind that she's needed to pull out of the tournament.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, it has sparked a hell of a lot of conversation. I think it's been fascinating to see how the debate has unfolded on social media specifically, and in the wider media. Almost immediately as soon as that statement went out, if you like, this is one of the biggest, the hottest properties, if you like, the biggest talents in tennis, male or female, right now, number 2 in the world. Huge name, huge story. I think that initial statement was kind of well intentioned. Obviously, she had her reasons. They weren't all that clear at that moment in time. Obviously, the subsequent statement that she released upon withdrawal shed a bit more light on the situation. But it was a statement that was kind of born of genuine concern for her own mental well-being and that of others in her position. Subsequently, kind of transpired that she struggled with depression since winning the US Open. I think her first Grand Slam, that would have been back in 2018. But yeah, I think the initial take was that this won't end well for anyone involved, really. And as you saw that kind of conversation unfold, the Grand Slam organisers, in this case, obviously the organisers of Roland Garros, were going to have to apply the letter of the law. The rules were going to demand fines, and she acknowledged that in their opening statement to say, look, I am going to be fined a significant amount. I think she was subsequently, after her first round match, fined $15,000, I believe. We'll get onto it, obviously, but I think, the first reaction was this won't end well. Obviously, it's it's not a good situation for her to be in, and there were more than a few well wishers and supporters of her for coming out and taking a stance on it. She doesn't feel up to doing the press conferences and facing the media. But yeah, I don't know what your take was, Owen. It was one of those things. It just felt like it wasn't going to end well. Everyone has having a take on it. Obviously, she was in the midst of it. She had a tournament to focus on. The media were all over it. It was the story heading into the grand, the clay court major. It just felt like there was something was going to give, and ultimately it was her, I suppose, by withdrawing.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with this story, and there is the personal story is one part of it, and it may be that she ultimately would not have felt that she was up to playing in this tournament either way, and that is not really something to speculate on, but it is a very positive thing in its way that she feels that she's able to talk about that, and I think it's important, and I think becomes a part of the bigger conversation going on around what role athletes have and what value the media gets out of these kind of exchanges on these pro forma terms, obligatory press conferences and post-match interviews and the like. There are things that are specific to tennis here. Some of these post-match conferences are pretty notorious for getting quite tetchy because you have this extraordinary range of tone in some of the questioning. You get people who are, who offer some quite banal questions. You get people who offer some quite disrespectful ones. I don't want to say, I think it's a strong term, but certainly for female players, they certainly do get exposed to some stuff at times that you wonder, is it really appropriate asking a professional athlete some of these questions? You get people who get incredibly interrogatory, and these are young people in very emotionally intense circumstances, and yeah, you do want to get their take from time to time, but I think if people know what the game is, and if they're willing to participate, and if they're in a frame of mind to participate, it's a slightly different thing from if they are genuinely feeling a little bit vulnerable and not in the mood to be pressed on certain things. So there's that element of it. I mean, there's a fantastic piece that I think has been widely shared on social media by Jonathan Liu in The Guardian, which talks about kind of the format of press conferences generally, and and what you really get out of them, and whether they are in fact a tiny bit outdated as a concept. But then it's, what do you replace them with? There have been a few journalists, and perhaps it's a conversation for a different day, but there have been a few journalists who pointed out that being able to hold people to account sometimes is valuable, and being able to give people an opportunity to put their side across is also valuable. But I think where this is all heading is more, I think, the structure of media responsibilities, as in the responsibilities of an athlete to make media appearances, perhaps than the idea that they should do media at all. These are contracts that were designed and rule sets that were designed for a different era of media, and we have access to these athletes and what they're thinking about. Perhaps it's more control, perhaps you still want to have some of these natural interactions, but is it appropriate to say either you talk to the press immediately after every game you play in, or you're fined, or perhaps have to default from a tournament? Naomi Osaka is in a position where she can pay the fine. Lots of tennis players are not in that position.
Yeah, I think that's been the really interesting discussion point here, is that question of access and control, and who should have it, and where the balance of power lies in that regard. Obviously, things have shifted into this, disintermediated landscape that we're in with social media. Athletes have a platform to speak directly to their fan base. The Grand Slam organisers, are looking to exert a level of control by having these rules in place to say, no, you have to come and speak to the media, and the media want access to get a first-hand account directly from the athlete's mouths. I mean, ultimately, Osaka could, or any other player can, leave the court now and immediately tweet something that would, doesn't matter what that is, but that could then, guide the narrative, if you like, within that press conference itself by the time she sits down to speak to the media. And so there's that dynamic ongoing there as well. I think that access and control argument is, as you say, I think a lot of this is outdated. I think the nature of the press conference in that format as we know it is probably somewhat outdated. I think, when you have an individual facing the world's media, they can feel, set upon by, ganged up upon probably by the media. I've never been in that position myself, Owen, of course, but you can see, if you're vulnerable, how uncomfortable that would make you, and especially if, as Osaka says, she's an introverted kind of character type. You can see that. But I think, you look at the response from the organisers of the Grand Slams, and it wasn't just the French Tennis Federation here. The other 3 Grand Slam organisers were signatories to the statement that they put out, which just felt very cold, very kind of threatening, very kind of lacking in compassion and understanding for, what she was going through. It was very to the point, matter of fact, and it kind of looked at things which seemed like an application of the rules in a very simplified and almost heavy-handed way. Yes, she can accept the punishment and others can't, and there can't be one rule for one and another for others. But I think that's a whole debate in itself, and hopefully, Osaka will return to the game soon, and obviously Wimbledon coming up, but to sit down with the powers that be and look at some of these protocols that are in place. I mean, that's ultimately, I think, what she's trying to achieve here. What she's set out to achieve is that some of the wording of these rules or the application of these rules does need revisiting, and she has every right to speak out and to move the conversation on, because clearly she feels, and she's speaking from experience, first-hand experience, but I'm sure there's other players in the locker room that have that shared experience as well. And there's an issue there. And, this is just one of many issues that I'm sure players would love to speak to the powers that be about and come to a solution. Yeah, I don't think you can limit access or control or censor any stakeholder with any sport and not expect some kind of backlash. So I think that's where we're at. I think it probably didn't help. I mean, it was sad to see from my point of view anyway, some of that not only that joint statement from the Grand Slam organisers, but some in the media and obviously the trolls online, of course, the way they reacted and how, the fact that there was a list produced the week before, naming Osaka as the highest paid female athlete in the world, $55 million income. There's this portrayal of her as this kind of spoiled, obnoxious, rich girl, kind of shirking her responsibilities because she can afford to do it. And I think that's way off the mark. Anyone that knows Osaka and has listened to what she's said, especially in the last year or so, and her support for the Black Lives Matter movement and others, other issues and social kind of justice issues and things like that, and her previous kind of form with the media and her graciousness with her time, I think there were just some nasty undertones to all of the criticism that she received around this, and it just really isn't helpful. I think in this particular situation, ultimately, one of the debates that has been sparked is the importance of kind of talking about mental health issues, and athletes are humans as well. And I think that's obviously very, very integral here, because I think ultimately if there is some understanding and compassion in amongst all of this, then the media are going to get more open and honest appraisals of performances and individuals by themselves over the course of time, and get better stories as a result of it, if there can be a bit of back and forth and understanding here. But as we all know in this world, it's pretty hard to achieve that level of understanding, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it is difficult when a discussion like this devolves into two sides who, or it becomes presented as two sides who are irreconcilable in their positions, and I don't think that's the case. And I think Osaka herself was careful in some of her statements to point out that this wasn't a personal thing about individual journalists. I mean, I did mention some of the questions that do find their way onto the women's tour, but that's not the majority. That's a minority, and there are some incredibly professional and thoughtful tennis journalists who are trying to add something to the coverage of the game. But it does have to be a conversation in order for that to really, I think, become as valuable as it can be. And the hope would be over the course of the next few weeks that the two tours and the slams and the ITF get together and they think about what the best way forward is to retain. People have written big checks to get access to these players or get access to coverage of the tournaments, and there is ultimately going to be a bottom line that people want to protect, but there are people involved in this as well. And whether it's some kind of opt-out, whether it's an opt-in system, whatever it ends up being, I think it's important. I mean, there's, some of these things are specific to tennis or specific to individual sports as well. The extent to which you are exposed as an individual athlete is quite different from being a professional football player. I mean, or, a professional team, a professional player in a team sport where different people can be put up and perhaps slightly more willing members of a team can be put forward on a certain occasion who are more comfortable in circumstances, in difficult circumstances. And there are people we haven't heard from in years outside of very controlled environments, and tennis players, golfers to an extent, track and field athletes to an extent, don't have the same get out in a lot of cases, and they are freelancers, lots of them. And as we say, not all of them make as much money as Naomi Osaka does. You do hope that there is a constructive way out of this. I mean, where it comes to a head is that idea of athletes holding quite a lot of power in the discourse because they have access to their own platforms. But I think that still runs out of steam eventually, and people are going to write about them come what may, and they're going to want to be involved in that construction of who they are and what their public profile is. And similarly, the people who are writing about them want to hear from them, and if you are able to put together insightful, meaningful commentary on whatever sport it is that you're covering, you absolutely want to hear from the people who are the subject of that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Obviously, some of the players on tour themselves have been asked this question, but speaking to the press is simply part of the job. You just do it, come what may, win or lose. For the press themselves, obviously getting a line from the athlete is very much their job, and somewhere you've got to meet in the middle and give each other what you want. I think it's also an interesting point about the kind of framework of tennis, in all individual sports, as you say, compared to team sports. But within tennis, where you have these member organizations specifically on the tour, the athletes have a seat at the table. They have representative groups. They're very much involved in the course of, or the commercial success of their tours. And you've seen with the PGA Tour recently, creating a fund to essentially dish out to the most marketable and by definition wealthiest players on tour who don't really need this money. Appearance fees in tennis are a hugely kind of underreported kind of element of it, but athletes pick and top tennis players, especially on the ATP tour, they pick and choose which tournaments they play at full stop anyway throughout the year and make it work for them. So by definition, they're skipping press conferences left, right, and centre if you look at it from that perspective. So, but yeah, I think in this case, obviously, it's the Grand Slam. It's at a Grand Slam. It's the pinnacle of the sport. They are a stakeholder within the sport, and they don't want to set a precedent for them. I mean, the irony of the president of the French Tennis Federation giving a statement and not taking questions immediately after it was kind of not lost on anyone in the tennis media. But everyone's pulling in different directions. I think it ultimately comes down to having the negotiations behind the scenes, having the discussions, and just handling it in a kind of humane and compassionate way, especially when it comes to mental health. I think we've just seen. Interestingly, you couldn't really make this up, but Petra Kvitova just dropping out of the tournament because she had rolled her ankle, I believe, during her press conference or post-match duties after round one. And whether that's the curse of Osaka or anything else, I don't know. But it's kind of, I think if an athlete has a physical ailment of some description, that's almost a valid excuse for them not to do something. Yet having a mental health problem doesn't seem to be. It's not spoken about in the same way. It's not viewed in the same light. It's not it's not a simple, straightforward thing to comprehend for a lot of people. And I think having the conversation off the back of this can only help. And I think that subsequent statement from Osaka to come out and be as candid as she was, I think she openly accepted that she didn't really word things in the right way first time round, and that's invariably going to happen when it comes straight from her, and she's gearing up for the intensity of a Grand Slam. But I think it's obviously an important discussion to have, and I think it's important that athletes can feel that they are can be open and honest, because like I say, I think the long term benefit of that is more compelling stories. There's more. You become more emotionally invested as a fan, I think, in individuals, and there's ultimately real life stories to tell beyond forehands and backhands and how many aces someone served. There's more to the sport than that, and all sports than that. I think everyone appreciates that, and so the media stand to benefit from telling those stories in the long run. It's a really interesting one, a really interesting debate.
You're listening to the SportsPro Podcast.
There was some football on, Mike, over the weekend. Don't know what stage of fatherhood you're at, whether you are constantly putting out fires, purely in a manner of speaking, or whether you're now anchored to the sofa and just have some kind of ambient noise on at all times. But Champions League final in Porto on Saturday, Chelsea beating a muddled looking Manchester City at the Estadio de Dragao. I think I've completely mangled that, but at Porto's home stadium. In the showdown between two former Super League clubs, got there in the end with the European club season. It feels like it's been going on absolutely forever. It's barely stopped since last June. But but we aren't quite ready to draw a line under the whole Super League thing yet. But I think you were off for the entirety of it. But Barcelona, Juventus, and Real Madrid still awaiting their reckoning for not letting go of that particular ball. But
It's a funny one. Obviously, having been at SportsPro for approaching 10 years, one of the biggest stories to break during that time, I was away for the entirety of it. But as you say, it's obviously still going, ongoing, rumbling away. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more than that. But to your point about putting out fires, and thankfully at this point, so early on, the fires are reachable from the sofa, and I was able to still be sat on the sofa whilst fighting fires and watching the final. Yeah, it's I'm glad to see the back of the football season. Although it's not the back of the football season, it's the back of the club football season, isn't it? Because of course we're gearing up for a big tournament in 10 days' time. It's just never ending. It's relentless. But as a Southampton fan, I can assure you, I'm glad to see the back of it.
But intriguing. I mean, there was a lot of discussion going into this final about where it was going to be held and unique circumstances, of course, as to what was and wasn't possible with wanting to get fans in and wanting to honour some of the contractual obligations that UEFA had to its partners and to organisations covering the event and safety protocols in the age of COVID, and weren't quite able to get it done in London between two English teams or in Cardiff, but were able to get a game with fans, and I think people were pretty grateful for that much. But interesting story emerging in the build up to the game from friend of the podcast Tarek Panja over at the New York Times, who reported that UEFA were quite taken with their emergency tournament last year, where they had, and this is something that has come up on the podcast before, but they were quite taken with the emergency tournament that they played in Portugal last year behind closed doors, where they played the quarterfinals, semi-finals, and the final in the space of a week. And they have been tinkering with the idea of having more of a set piece around the final, not just making it a weekend, but adding perhaps the two semi-finals and playing that in one venue over the course of a week and surrounding it with concerts and street parties and sponsor activations of various stripes. Really interesting. Could be a lot of fun. Does tamper with whatever we are at now, 60, 70 years of European semi-finals having home and away legs, which is another conversation. But there are certainly merits to that kind of an idea. It continues the showdown between some of the major stakeholders in football, and particularly between FIFA and UEFA, because I suppose it is effectively turning the Champions League into another mini tournament, or turning the Champions League final into another mini tournament. But then it's interesting for sponsors who get to activate around this big event. I think Tim Crow was quoted in Tarek's piece as saying that much. And I think it becomes interesting for hosts, because we're probably moving towards an age where the mega event model is a difficult one for a lot of people to pull off. But having this kind of middle tier and another kind of prestige event entering this middle tier becomes an intriguing proposition.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's no better time coming off the back of the experience of COVID, and the impact it's had on the game and finances, to kind of entertain these kinds of ideas specifically within European football. And there are ideas, as we all know, being bandied around and discussed behind the scenes. And I think this would be one that there would be some appetite for. There clearly is, not just from UEFA's standpoint, but potentially from sponsors, as you say, to have those additional properties and events and festivities to activate around the kind of media focus on this event for more of a sustained period than perhaps 2 days, 3 days beforehand, as the teams start arriving in the host city. Provides some operational certainty. Obviously, I think whether the clubs would want it, I'm sure there'll be differences of opinion among the clubs, as invariably there always is. But there was a UEFA report just recently, I think last week, citing losses running into around €9 billion and things like that. So again, it's I guess the question is, will it make clubs and UEFA more money for distribution amongst those competing clubs? Obviously, there's a need to balance the revenue. Do obviously two-legged semi-finals, as Tarek I think cites in his piece. That's some of the most coveted inventory in world football. Versus one-off matches, you're invariably losing 2 games from the season. So there's that to weigh up as well. But I think the concept of the Final Four is obviously well established. EuroLeague basketball just had their Final Four in Cologne last weekend. It's been successful for them, and it's farmed out to different cities across the continent year after year. Obviously, in college basketball in the US. And the Super Bowl as well. We all talk about the Super Bowl being essentially a mega event. It's not just a one-off game. It's a whole week-long festivities. You look at All-Star weeks and things like that in the major leagues as well, and they're everything bundled up within them. So yeah, I think there's going to be legs. There's going to people seriously looking at it, and what the appetite is. We'll have to see. I guess when's the soonest this could possibly come in? The reforms are coming in 2024, I believe, to the Champions League.
That would be my understanding of it. I think the report is that they will be discussing this towards the end of the year, and it would be plugging into this new model because, as you say, losing 2 games from the broadcast schedules would be perhaps a bit too much to swallow in the current format, but in the new 36-team Swiss League model that we're all so very much looking forward to in 2024, that's a lot more games to perhaps spread some of the risk as far as that goes. I mean, it is quite funny to be for this to have come up after weeks in which we were talking about the big teams playing each other more often, and this is the opportunity normally for 4 marquee teams to all be playing against each other, and you're taking 2 of those away, but you are creating more of a focal point around those matches. You're not kind of dissipating the impact to quite the same extent. I suppose the clubs will be thinking that's 2 home games, or it's a home game each that they're giving up, and that's another few million quid normally in the cases of the teams who get to this stage of the Champions League. But perhaps,
yeah, I can see sorry to jump in. There would be something lost within that. That loss of home and away. I think the ITF in tennis, for example, has probably seen that with the Davis Cup finals moving to Madrid, a single neutral site. I think you do lose an element of that, albeit they have reverted to a multi-city approach. I think from pretty soon. Anyway, I don't know when it's coming in. But yeah, you obviously you do lose something there. But from the host perspective, as you say, I think creating this kind of slightly lower tier, more manageable event would, there would surely be appetite for that, and bringing fans in and sponsors in for an extended period, filling hotel rooms, eating out, doing everything else that comes with it. There's going to be appetite for that. So there's obviously that piece to it as well that's certainly worth considering, and I'm sure UEFA will be.
Yeah, and cities rather who would have been looking to Euro 2020 as an opportunity to be involved in a major event, who perhaps were never going to host the European Championship solo. They're getting a quite heavily diluted version of that this summer because of the lack of fans, because of the lack of travel. But that would be something that UEFA could take to member associations, could take to think of countries that really don't have that much chance of, or that much chance of putting together the infrastructure to host a major championships without sharing it. A couple of the host cities, the Republic of Ireland springs to mind as one, Scotland perhaps as another, where they might be able to host something together, but they're not going to be able to do it on their own. And the idea that if you can get your ground up to Champions League final standard, that you could become. I mean, you say it's lower tier. It's a very prestigious event, but it moves into it's lower obligation, I guess, rather than lower tier. But yeah, whatever will the other factions trying to redraw the football calendar in the years ahead make of it, when we have World Cups every 2 years and Club World Cups every year and all the rest. It's something we'll have to give at some point when it comes to all of this stuff.
European Super League grand finals. Presumably, you just wouldn't want them all clashing, falling on the same weekend, because that would be missed opportunity.
Well, that's just a straight round robin, I think, over the course of 3 or 4 days with those 3 teams involved.
Yeah.
Big weekend for West London football clubs because Brentford were also promoted to the Premier League.
Yeah, how refreshing to see a new name added to the list of Premier League teams. I mean, the other two being promoted very much, with all due respect, yo-yo clubs, familiar names in the league. So yeah, great to see Brentford with their new stadium hitting the big time in the richest game in world soccer. I believe we're still referring to it as.
And also a counterpoint to, first of all, the two clubs who were involved later on Saturday. City and Chelsea have very generous benefactors who've sunk an awful lot of money into player recruitment, and in City's case, into infrastructure as well. Brentford have built themselves up as a club over the last decade under their owner Matthew Benham, but have kind of zigged where lots of people have zagged. They've done a few things that are unusual. I think they don't have a full academy set up as it now exists in English football because of basically the competition for talent and the fact that it wouldn't be an enormously sensible use of their resources to go up against Chelsea, Fulham, QPR, Arsenal, Tottenham, West Ham, Crystal Palace, all within kind of 10 miles or so of them. And they were, until incredibly recently, in what would be considered the antithesis of a Champions League final, hosting stadium at Griffin Park with standing room still at both ends, and let's say modest or humble facilities. It was a great, very, very fun place to go and watch football, but I think perhaps time had caught up with it a little bit, and they have been waiting for several years to make the move to the community stadium, which they have done so this season, but for which the first game with fans was a playoff semi-final, and the first full fixture will be a Premier League game, which is pretty extraordinary. I think it will be a team that gets a lot of attention now over the period leading up to the start of the new Premier League season, and it does offer another model for how to run a football club. I mean, something that Jordan Gardner, I think, wrote on our site in the wake of the Super League fiasco, and I think perhaps pointing most strongly to some of the teams who are still involved, but certainly looking across the board at the clubs who were motivated to join that project and their reasons for doing so, basically being that European football teams have a tendency to spend all of the money that comes their way, and cost control is not a strong suit in a lot of cases. And the fact that you can be competitive without taking the kind of risks that are pretty notorious for that part of the championship as well. That kind of the top half of the championship teams do tend to gamble.
Yeah, overextend in pursuit of the promised land. I think, yeah, I mean, getting to this point is, I think promotion to the Premier League is one thing. I think staying there is another thing altogether. I think you look at a club like Bournemouth, who were able to stay in the league for several years before ultimately dropping out with a very small stadium, and but fantastic coaching, approach to coaching, and doing so with unheralded players and things like that. I think it'd be interesting to see, whether Brentford go entirely their own way or they model themselves on someone else. They're not obviously, as you alluded to, they're not a Newcastle or a Leeds or an Aston Villa kind of bouncing back, and big clubs with big followings. They're going to approach things differently, surely. But yeah, good luck to them.
Good luck indeed. Right, I think we'll leave it at that for this part of the podcast. We are going to be talking after the break about the white paper that SportsPro has put out in partnership with Limelight Networks, making the personal possible, powering interactivity and new experiences in Sports OTT. And we are going to be talking about that with Charlie Kraus from Limelight Networks just after this.
Hello, I'm Matt Rogan. I've spent my career creating and scaling businesses in sports and entertainment. And now I'm talking to smart leaders inside and outside sport to get their ideas on managing change and building towards a better future. You can listen in on the Playbook podcast, a collection of candid, agenda-free conversations full of practical advice your company can work with. Get your new episodes right here on the SportsPro feed, and check out the rest of the series wherever you get your podcasts.
Charlie Kraus, Senior Manager for Product Marketing for Video at Limelight Networks. Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Hope this is very informative for everyone and they learn something from this.
I'm sure it will be. We're going to be talking about the white paper that Limelight has produced in partnership with SportsPro, making the personal possible, powering interactivity and new experiences in sports OTT. Before we dive into some of the conversation around what's covered in the white paper, what can you tell us about the white paper itself? What is it? What's it focused on?
Well, it's really about fan engagement. So we're going to explore various features that people are innovating in terms of driving more fan engagement, and we'll talk about some examples of best practices on integrating these kind of functions within an OTT service that has a direct impact on the bottom line. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last year is, when you think of sports rights and what happened during the pandemic and no fans in stadiums, and as we come out of that now, we've seen that it's not just the traditional broadcasters that are competing for rights. We see the large social media companies. They've been in the fray, but really big time now. So we've seen, when you think about Amazon and some others, they're bidding too, and that's bidding up the price very, very high. So you have rights holders paying billions, whether it's dollars or euros, for rights. And so they have a big problem. They have to increase the number of viewers that they get on these matches and monetize them better. So it's driving a lot of innovation. And how do I get more fans and how do I engage them and keep them coming back?
So I mean, there's two things I suppose that are involved here. One is that we're a few years down the road really from streaming being anything like an add-on. It is now kind of the baseline industry standard, and also people are less willing, because they've got used to watching stuff on demand through services like Netflix and Amazon. People are less willing to put up with buffering and latency and the kind of stuff that would have been, the central focus a few years ago for people on the tech side of things. And you're also seeing, because there is a greater adoption of streaming, you're seeing this push to personalize the experience and to, as you say, to drive a little bit more revenues through it. First of all, what are some of the trends that we're seeing that are driving adoption and continuing that rush away from traditional linear services to streaming?
Sure. So I see this from a couple of sides. So if I start with the rights owners themselves, we've noticed on some of the very big events. So here in the US, our Super Bowl is the biggest sports event over here. And over the last few years, the number of people watching the actual, the traditional broadcast has slowly eroded a few percentage per year. It used to be 110 million. Now it's slipped below 100 million. But on the other side, the same broadcasters are now offering streams of it as well. And the idea is just capturing more viewers because they have all that money to monetize, have all that money invested to monetize. So we saw that it dropped below 100 million, but almost 6 million watched the stream from the same broadcaster. So it's kind of making up the difference. So, that's it on the sports side. But just in general, starting with Netflix and some of the other OTT on-demand services, people have gotten used to now thinking about when they want to watch something that's entertaining, they think of OTT first very often, especially Netflix and all of those services. They look at it started with that. And then it got into, well, gee, they really have pretty good content. And at least on the US side, some of the big networks have, done more like reality TV, unscripted shows that are cheaper to produce, and have sort of walked away from trying to produce, very high-end premium series and movies and things like that. And that's going there. But broadcast isn't going away. It's still only 5 or 6% on a big sports match that are watching a stream versus the broadcast, and I think that's true for European football. It's hundreds of millions of people are still watching broadcast, but you still maybe get 10 million streaming.
Okay, well, something that is delved into a bit in the white paper are the different forms of engagement that the broadcasters and OTT providers are supplying and that they're trying out to try and differentiate their services. But let's explore the tech side of this a little bit. What's the baseline, first of all, for being able to deliver reliable live video? Because that's the fundamental thing for sports audiences. And then how does that change once you start to introduce interactive elements? Being able to change camera angles, bring up in-game statistics, more complex things than that we will get into, gamified elements and so on top of that.
Yeah, that's a great topic because I'm in the middle of that with Limelight right now, is supporting that kind of transition. So I think at this point, in any surveys I've seen, and I run video surveys every year, is that viewers just expect a broadcast-like experience. So it's just broadcast quality picture. There's no rebuffering. It's anywhere reach, and that means anywhere, no matter where they are, anywhere. They want to be able to watch it and on any device they want to watch it on. They just expect it to just work, and it should be simple, and the picture quality should be high. And the way we're doing this is using tried and true HLS and Dash streaming that's been around for years and years and years. We're improving it with things like smaller chunk sizes to get the latency down. But the global CDN infrastructure is just massive in terms of being able to deliver that kind of HLS and Dash traffic at quality. And so it does that. Now, when you add interactivity into the mix, that changes things. And when I say interactive, I'm talking about the cases where you really need to have real time or below second. If you're going to have a chat, or if you're going to do live polling, or we'll get into betting at some point here, it has to be below 1 second. And that cannot be done with traditional HLS and Dash streaming. You have to use a technology like WebRTC. So not only Limelight, but most CDNs and many other startups are now starting to deliver WebRTC, which can do that. Now, it's a different technology. It's not chunk streaming. It's UDP delivery, which means it's not, there's no acknowledgments. It's sort of, you send the traffic out and you hope for the best. It uses adaptive bit rate to get the picture quality there. But that technology is optimized around low latency, nothing else. So it will sacrifice anything to maintain that latency. If it has to drop the bit rate down and make the picture quality a little bit worse to maintain the latency, it will do that. And in the worst case, it will even stop the video and keep the audio going. But the whole optimization is most important. Keep that latency down below a second. So that impacts things. And then the infrastructure behind that, because if you're having people answering polls, now it's a two-way conversation. So you're having polls, people respond to the polls. We have things like these WeChat and watch party kind of things coming up for sports, where people can share watching a stream together and talk about it. The way you might go to visit go to each other's houses or a sports bar right now. And that's, it's all of these like direct in-event betting will come up, direct monetization like that. And then personalization is part of this too. When you have that low latency, you can do personalization. So people are looking at, dynamic ad insert, making ads relevant to the user. And because you have something that broadcast doesn't have, you have an IP address of every viewer out there. You can give them things like more relevant ads if they want. Maybe they want to follow the stats of a certain player. You watch a match and maybe a little augmented reality kind of messages appear over players, like some stat about them right in match. But managing all that is that's a technical challenge. You need a very robust infrastructure to handle all that while still delivering the expected picture quality.
You talked there about WebRTC. What is that? How would you explain that to a layman?
So WebRTC is actually an older technology. Google actually drove this back in 2012 as a way to run an app they had called Hangouts. So people might remember when you're using Google Mail and so forth, you have this Hangout platform. It was like an early form of Zoom. You could just click on somebody's name, and you could have a video or not, or you can just chat. And what people noticed is, I'm talking to somebody in Singapore and I'm in New York, and it's as if they're in the same room. There's no latency there. How do they do that? So it's with UDP traffic. Again, it eliminates this acknowledgement with HTTP, where you send a packet, you wait for an acknowledgement, then you send another packet. That's part of what drives the latency. The other is you have to build a buffer, because you just don't know what the conditions are between the source of the video and the viewer. So you have to have a little buffer built in there to account for and smooth that out. Well, all those things add latency. So WebRTC does away with that. You just have a stream and it just out it goes with no acknowledgments. And if the quality goes down, it just simply lowers the bit rate and slows, tries to slow down the amount of video bits that are sent to improve it. So in the early days of WebRTC, sometimes the picture quality wasn't good, but the latency was there. It was hundreds of milliseconds.
So what are the challenges then? Because obviously, if you're having a remote conversation with somebody and it's a personal or a private conversation, you are going to put up with more than if you're paying for an OTT service and whatever bells and whistles that you're getting on top of that. So what are the challenges if you're applying WebRTC and not putting in some of those measures that you explained in a traditional stream?
So our experience with it is we've had to add infrastructure to our network, and I can speak for just the WebRTC community in general here. There are startup providers that are just focused on WebRTC, and what you have to do is it's very much like almost like an edge compute thing. Is you ingest a stream, and now you have to send it out to infrastructure around the world, where anybody that wants to receive it. So you have sort of edge servers, and if it's a CDN, we have edge servers all over the world, and hundreds of POPs. But you have to put in specific edge servers that take that stream and turn it into WebRTC and deliver it out. So that's where if you have 10 people watching the same stream at the same place, you send out one and then you have to replicate it and send it out. It puts just a burden on increasing the infrastructure. And so the only way around this is to sort of over provision a bit. When we do a big streaming event, we always ask them, how many viewers do you expect at what bit rates? And we over allocate bandwidth to that event. But sometimes you just don't know what may happen. We'll get into microtransactions in a minute and what happens during a match when suddenly more people log on. But we always have a lot of extra capacity to do that. And that's really how you sort of power your way out of it. Lots of servers that can handle that specific type of traffic, tuned for that. And if you have enough of that in place and you do a lot of monitoring, always on a live, especially live, you're always monitoring viewer traffic. You get feedback from the players about what they're seeing, and you can, when we're monitoring during live events, we can see what's going on in different parts of the world and different POPs and make adjustments. And we could head off problems before they begin, because we can sort of see, wow, a lot of traffic seems to be building in a certain area, so we can configure our way out of that even during a live event. But it's early days for it. So far, we've had a lot of very successful WebRTC events from everybody that does it right now. But as they grow bigger and this scales up, we have to scale up with it.
And how does delivering a shared stream, a watch together kind of experience, how does that compare as a technical exercise with some of the two-way interactivity that we're going to get onto with betting and gaming and so on?
So real-time type streaming, or WebRTC, is part of that, but it's a little perverse. Most of these watches are for maybe 6, 7, 8 people together, and instead of trying to be sub-second, what they do is they actually force a delay. So they look at if you have these 6 people, they could be anywhere in the world. So it's sort of the least common denominator. Who has the slowest link? And you pace everybody to that. So I know the NFL has a thing called Watch Together, and they actually force a 20-second, I believe, latency to everybody. And the idea is, because it's just you and your 6 friends are only watching this stream, the fact that it's 6 seconds or 20 seconds behind real doesn't matter. It's not like the situation of somebody watching a broadcast texting somebody watching on a mobile device and having it be 30-second lag, because you're all watching the same stream. It doesn't matter that it's 20 seconds, but that makes sure that nobody is, they're all seeing, for them, they see it at the same time. Where the WebRTC element comes in is for the chat. Like we're chatting now, so you can't have a 20-second delay of chat back and forth. So the chat part uses WebRTC, but the video delivery part is just HLS or Dash, they just tune the chunk size for a 20-second delay. So it's kind of perverse when you think about, real time and actually delaying things. But that's how they're done.
This is the SportsPro Podcast.
Okay, let's talk about some of the direct monetization options that broadcasters have. There's a lot of conversation at the moment in the US about betting, integrating betting, but coming down the track as well, there are a few providers who are thinking about ways of bringing e-commerce into the mix, and perhaps the classic thing being either you buy merchandise from a player who you just thought, oh, you know what, it's time to get that guy's shirt or her shirt because they've really been tearing it up, or you've got a load of friends around in real life rather than on a chat, and you decided you want to get a takeaway in, and you have whatever delivery service integrated too. What are some of the things that broadcasters and media companies are going to have to be aware of when it comes to bringing those kind of services in?
Right. So this is one of my favorite things to pay attention to right now. So I'll just start by saying that the legalization of this is pretty spotty, around the world. Like the UK is one of the most open in terms of betting on sports and so forth. It's been around for a long time. In the United States, it's very regional. So there's some states that approve it. I think there's maybe 10, something like that. We expect by the end of the year maybe to have 30 states that legalize. I always like to say follow the money. If you want to understand what motivations for things. Because it used to be only Las Vegas that had gambling, but then a lot of states now have lotteries because they've watched. People are going to bet whether it's legal or not, and they might as well capture the revenue. So with sports betting, we know people have bet on sports forever, and Super Bowl is always these grids, and they have March Madness basketball, and it's about 97% of the betting on those things is technically illegal, but it happens. So people are just saying, well, we should capture some of that revenue. But betting has always a sort of a little unsavory tinge to it when it involves sports. There's in history you have these cases of players being bribed. There's always these odd events, but there's a lot of money online. You have to worry about that. So the things that are come up is a lot of the integrity of the betting itself. When you're putting, especially this in-event betting, when it's a live game and you're going to put in these little micro bets, like in European football, the offense is going down the field. You can offer a bet. Is he going to make a shot, a goal? Is he going to score a goal? And within milliseconds, people could make quick little bets on that. So, but how do they set the odds for these things? So you have companies like BetRadar, SportsRadar. This is their business. They have the massive amounts of data on players and all their stats. And so they have the engines for that. But there's lots of compliance issues. Different regions have different compliance issues. How do we make sure that about the integrity of that? Are they properly using artificial intelligence or machine learning? How are they using the sport radar data? And if there's anything that ever, this is just nascent now, but if there's scandals or any issues with that, that'll really slow things down and put the brakes on it. Not a lot of leagues here. The NBA is really going fast into doing it themselves. NFL so far doesn't want anything to do with it, but maybe when they see what happens in other leagues, they will. You have unlicensed operators a lot, and when you think about when you're betting, that means you have to have bank information in there. You have to be able to put money in with a credit card. You need to be able to withdraw winnings. So you have the whole security thing. How do you protect all that privacy data? And we see this every week about breaches in security with retailers and anything that involves this data. And we clearly haven't nailed down how to protect this stuff. So you have all these factors all come together like a perfect storm when you start talking about in-event betting. And then you have the technical complications, right? This is where real-time streaming really comes in, because people in a stadium watching the same event you are could be making the same kind of bets, and they're at the event. So if you're remote online, you can't have very much latency there when you're betting against people that are watching the event live. So it's a technical challenging thing. Before the pandemic, there was an event in New York put on by Sport Radar just on this topic. It was like a 2-day event talking about how all this is coming to fruition, and it's mind-boggling the complexity that you get into with this.
And then to take the second part of that, and aside from the security issues around betting, when you're integrating any kind of retail any kind of additional payments into a stream, as I said, through e-commerce, through merchandising, and perhaps through other kinds of delivery, food delivery in the future. What's some of the technology that's going to be able to underpin that kind of activity?
Yeah, so coupled with the low latency, WebRTC allows for a data sharing, or some people refer to it as a data channel, but it's a side channel. Some of it's WebSocket based. Our real-time streaming has a different way of doing this, but it's a side channel or a side thing to share data. So you can send messages back and forth. You can offer a bet. You can say you want to pay for something. You can take polls. So it's just running in parallel with the video stream, and that's a data sharing thing. So it's not locked synchronization, but it's all within a plus or minus 100 millisecond kind of time window. So it's, to the eye, it looks like it's, lock synced in, where a player's going down the field and you offer something. You say, I want to buy his jersey. You just scored a goal and you say, oh, I want to buy his jersey. And all that is sort of going on, it's all think of it like a parallel universe of live transactions going on a data channel right alongside the video. So that was important to build that into WebRTC implementations to accommodate that.
So the other trend that it's been talked about for a few years. I think it was 2018 that the NBA first trialed this, but we've seen the emergence of services like Buzzer, which is kind of a notifications app that a couple of the leagues, the NHL, PGA Tour, so far are working with to drive people towards the live broadcast. But it's microtransactions. It's letting people buy access to streams as they come in. And I mean, one of the things that OTT operators and broadcasters running streams have talked about for a few years is that immediately that kind of rush that you get at the start of an event. You might have a lot of people subscribing late to a service, say a boxing match, and people have to subscribe late on a Saturday evening, and then you suddenly got a lot more people on your stream, and that's a challenge you have to prepare for. How much complexity do microtransactions of that nature add in that respect?
So yeah, it's like there's sort of two login problems you have. We find with a lot of sporting events, a lot of people wait till almost a minute before they start, to log in, and so you get this huge rush of massive amount of login attempts, and this is where often you see streaming of games go wrong, especially early on, where people don't log in a half an hour ahead of time just to watch the pregame stuff, and then on like a minute before you can get hundreds of thousands of login attempts, and if people don't have if there isn't the right infrastructure on their servers to be able to handle that, then people have to wait. They try to log in, you have to wait, and sometimes the match might even start and they're still not logged in. So people over time, just from experience, have learned how much infrastructure it takes to handle the expected volume over what period of time of people logging in. And that's at the beginning of the match. Now, on the other end of it, you have a match goes on, and and you think about alerts when it comes into, let's say, the 85th minute of a football match and the score's tied. Well, the alert thing, well, people get alerted about it. Maybe they haven't been watching. All of a sudden, you get these alerts. You say, oh, well, now it's exciting. 5 minutes to go in regulation time. And you can get these massive spikes quickly trying to watch the last minutes of a particular match. So it's just, we just have learned you can't over provision too much. You really have to just have that scale of your login servers. And it's just, you have to power out of it. Everybody just, they'd love to just want to log in and boom, it just happens. But the fact is sometimes especially you get even more anxious at the end of the game, maybe more than the beginning, if you're not getting in within seconds and it's waiting and you're watching the clock and, I don't want to miss, maybe the goal that comes in with 1 second left. So that there's more emphasis on making that better than the beginning, I think.
What are some of the other trends that we should be looking out for in this area through the rest of 2021, but then also over the next few years? Are we seeing certain behaviors develop within sport? Are we seeing things perhaps in the gaming space or in other places that are going to inform how people watch sport and the demands there are going to be in terms of personalization in the next few years?
Sure. This is a pretty rich area. So as I read through and prepared for this, I sort of jotted down, I think, with the things that I'm watching with a lot of view. One is multi-view screens. So it's a lot of experimentation, but when you're watching it, just having more cameras around an event and let people choose whether they want to watch from the end zone or from the sideline or from above. The cameras are there. If you watch a broadcast, the cameras are there, and they're choosing where they're going to show you. If there's a play and there's a penalty, they will show you quickly. Here's what it looks like from above, from the left, from the right, and all that. But they're choosing what to show you with streaming. Now you'd have the viewer could take the show. I want to choose which way I want to watch this. I want to go back. I'm going to see something like, as a match is going on, sure, there's highlights, but instead of waiting to post the highlights to the website when things are over or the day later, just as you have those highlights being curated, start posting them right away, so that even though they're watching live, says, wait a minute, I want to go back. Maybe there's a commercial break and he wants to go back and just watch a quick video. So keep them posted right away. Split screen matches. So if you're watching your favorite team, but you may have another team that you're interested in, maybe one of their rivals, how's their game going at the same time? So the ability to split your screen and watch two matches at once. I think DAZN did a test earlier with a split with 4 screens, so you could watch 4 different matches or just different views of it. And I know in my office here during our March Madness last year, one of my coworkers was such a fan of this. He had like 5 monitors in his cubicle, all in around a range on each one to a different game, because when they're all of them going on at the same time. And I said, well, I guess you're not getting any work done this afternoon, because he's sitting there trying to watch 5 basketball games at once. We sort of talk about watch together. They're starting. They're going to be very prevalent. It's another augmented reality. I'm much more of a fan of this than virtual reality. I still think virtual reality is a niche for gaming. You're only seeing what's being presented, and you got to be sitting still, because you can't walk around with VR glasses on, or you're going to run into things. So I think augmented reality, where you just have little graphics like maybe above a player's head with some stats while the game's going on, that doesn't disturb what you're watching. You can look at that. I think 5G, although maybe not everybody talks about it in terms of bandwidth and latency, I think it's more about bandwidth. And certainly for better quality 4K and 8Ks, you're going to see with the Tokyo Olympics, but 8K is coming. We haven't settled 4K yet, but here comes 8K. You need a lot of bandwidth for that. But I caution people that, it's end to end. Just because your last mile connection is 5G, does that mean that your entire connection back to the source of the video is at that speed? The slowest speed will pace that connection. So I just warn people that be careful about how 5G and Edge all work together. It's not so much a latency play as a bandwidth play, to me. But that'll be big. Connected TV, another one, connected TV. So for a while, it was the most consumption of live stream tend to be on mobile devices, but there's always this thing of the best screen available. So if you're walking around, the best screen available is your mobile device. But if you're home, the best screen available, especially for sports, is often the biggest screen. So sort of, especially for sports, the idea of watching, I want to watch it on a big screen. And if I'm going to be home, I'm going to have a big TV. And most people, if they don't have a smart TV, will get a Roku or a Fire Stick, and that's how they stream it in. So those are sort of making a comeback. I think we're going to see a little less, watching it on a small screen, and it's just whatever the best is available, and that might be. So those are sort of the top ones I quickly noted.
All right, well, lots to look out for in the next couple of years or so. But I would encourage everyone also to have a look on sportspromedia.com and download the white paper, Making the Personal Possible, Powering Interactivity and New Experiences in Sports OTT. Charlie, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I was happy to do it. It was very useful and entertaining to me as well.
Get the very best of SportsPro sent straight to your inbox. Head to sportspromedia.com and sign up for the SportsPro Daily. You'll get a roundup of all the biggest stories, features and opinion from our team every single morning. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
Okay, that will do it for another SportsPro podcast. Thank you to Charlie Kraus for his time there. A reminder that you will be able to find the white paper on sportspromedia.com. We will also put a link in the show notes so you can get your download directly from your podcast platform of choice. Thank you as well to Michael Long. Good to have you back.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Good to be back.
And congratulations again from the entire SportsPro podcast community. I am sure we'll be back next week with Euro 2020. We've also got an interview about MLB in the days before that. But yeah, then it's going to be wall-to-wall football. And speak to you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.